Mother. My mother died several small deaths in her late 70s and early 80s. TIAs, they were called. Transient mini-strokes that left her more incapacitated each time and frightened. But my mother was very brave and tried to make the best of it for my father's sake. She always had doted on him since they were 16, and he was virtually incapable of boiling an egg or hanging a picture or shopping for groceries alone. They went on their honeymoon with another couple, the Aronoffs, and my father got sunburned, which, Mom frequently implied, cramped his style considerably. Long before the TIAs, when her hands were still steady and her eyes still bright, my mother painstakingly and over a long period of time knitted an Afghan for me. In itself, that was not unusual. My mother, and my mother-in-law, Maxine Lewis, often knitted beautiful Afghans for us and our children through the years. But this Afghan was special. My mother was very proud that I was a TV producer, although she claimed she never watched an entire program. Only the credits, losing interest after my name appeared. My father, on the other hand, studied each show with great care, afterwards commenting on particular plot points or performances that he favored or questioned. When my brother and I brought home A's, Dad frequently questioned the absence of A+. This special Afghan? My mother had knitted into it the title of every show and the name of every studio and network I'd ever worked for, until the Afghan, colorful and lovingly designed, was too large and cumbersome for her to handle. It was a birthday present, given with tears and apologies for not having been able to keep up with my credits. I still have it, turning threadbare with my mother's fingers and hands in it everywhere, and her heart. At my kid brother Roy's suggestion, and close to his own, we purchased a condo in Palm Springs with my parents when my father retired. It was the first place they had ever owned. My father bought it impulsively, much to my mother's amazement. Decisions always bothered him. Largely, I think, because it was similar to their apartment in San Francisco. I remember a beautiful 2-story white house in Arlington, Mass., which my father could have bought for $8,500 when I was a kid. He was afraid of the mortgage payments, but at least he must have been looking, or else how would I remember so clearly? Later, he balked at buying the $13,500 contemporary Eichler-designed house in Palo Alto where we moved there. It's worth over $400,000 now, I hear. And again, when the small Beverly Hills apartment he lived with Mom and Roy went on the market for $90,000. He thrived in the desert heat, but my mother wilted. So eventually they moved to a small, comfortable house in Rancho Bernardo, near San Diego, where it was always pleasant and cool. There was a Chabad community close by, which welcomed my folks with open arms. Life was good for a time, except for the small deaths. We encouraged them to get live-in help, and a college kid stayed with them for a while, who was generally okay, my father said, except for the candy wrappers under her bed and her loud TV. Deborah and I drove down from Woodland Hills whenever we could, and on one occasion, after a particularly debilitating incident, my mother eased herself from her chair to the floor and showed us, with no embarrassment or self-consciousness, how she managed to crawl. She'd been a great beauty, with dark red hair, blue eyes, and good legs. She prided herself on her legs. And as she got older, and photos became less flattering, she needed to be reminded from time to time that her legs were still good. When my father passed the bar and went into private practice, long before he became an administrative law judge, she worked for an ophthalmologist, and later as a legal secretary in my father's office to help out. They kept in touch with lifelong friends from school until they began dying one by one. And when I was growing up, before TV, my folks belonged to a book group, went to the theater. My father had been an amateur actor and wanted to make that his profession, but his parents disapproved. And every weekend we listened to symphonic music or opera on the radio. At night, I would lie awake listening to their conversations with visitors and relishing the laughter when my father told one of his endearing and often embellished stories. I had severe asthma as a child. I missed so much school one year that I took the rest of it off to get a job in Washington, clerking for a mail-order radio repair school. The work was routine, but I liked it. And at 15 or so, I took a certain pride in doing it well. I also felt guilt when I lied that I'd stay indefinitely, knowing I'd return to school the next semester. My brother told me much later that he thought I was going to die when he heard me at night, wheezing and sometimes pounding the wall. It was always my mother who got up with me. She'd call Dr. Percy, who still made house calls, and he'd eventually arrive with his soothing shots of adrenaline and his throat sticks on which he pencil-sketched marvelous tiny horse-drawn carriages. Finally, the asthma attacks were so frequent that Dr. Percy showed my mother how to boil the needles and syringes, put them together, and administer the shots herself. In those days, syringes came in separate parts, which had to be disinfected and assembled. My poor mother, she was a bundle of nerves at best, and I'll never know how she pulled herself together long enough to give me a jab. The needles were always dull, and her hands always shook, but I pretended she was an expert, gritted my teeth, and waited patiently for the welcome adrenaline to kick in. Afterward, my mother would go into the kitchen and make us cups of tea milk, and then she'd sit on my bed, and we'd sip together and talk until I quieted down enough to sleep. About that time, my father would come in to see if everything was all right. I was never sure whether or not he actually awoke to check on me, because right after he left, I could hear him emptying his bladder mightily in the bathroom. My mother loved to laugh, and my brother and I frequently drove her to tears of laughter, vying with each other to see who could get the biggest reaction. She and I enjoyed rearranging furniture, which drove my father crazy, almost literally. We didn't understand at the time why my father simply could not tolerate any change to the status quo. His reactions were invariably volatile, and my mother got the worst of it. He was never demonstrative with her, except for occasional brief kiss and the flowers he brought her on Fridays after work. But she once told my daughter Melissa, with questionable propriety, I thought, that he still enjoyed sex. When she died, he showed no outward signs of emotion, but he mourned inwardly and deeply. His role models from Eastern Europe had been Stoics, and we mourned her together in the shul where my father was well enough. Once when our kids were small, we all sat around the dining room table and played the Who Am I game, asking each person in turn to answer the first 10 things that came to mind. I remember vividly my father's lawyerly, spontaneous, and naked admission. "I'm a dispenser of justice," he said. My mother answered, "I'm a mother, a wife, and a homemaker." I think she actually said housewife. Susan, our youngest, said simply, "I'm Susan." Deborah's list included person, artist, wife, mother, daughter, therapist, student, teacher. I'm sure there was more than 10. And she's still going strong. Seeing my mother crawling that day reminded me of another time I saw her on her knees. We realized by then that my father was manic-depressive and obsessive-compulsive, although we weren't too sure what that meant. My mother simply called him a pain in the ass when he really annoyed her. They had a fringed oriental rug in the living room, and when he came home from work, it was Dad's custom to lean down and straighten the fringe, combing it at both ends with his fingers. I remember once in the winter, he did it before taking off his top coat. My mother tolerated it for a while, but one day something snapped. She grabbed a scissors, got down on her hands and knees, and hacked off as much of the fringe as she could. Unfortunately, not meaning to, she cut into the rug itself, just a tiny slit at one edge. She was frantic. She tried to mend it from the back with tape, and she did a fair job of it, but it was the first thing my father noticed when he came home. I don't know how we all survived. I stayed with my father in their apartment while my mother was dying. When the call came late at night, I woke him up, and we drove together through the fog to the hospital. She was still conscious, but the nurse looked grim. We went into her, and I told her I loved her. She said, "I love you too." I can't remember if my father managed to say anything before she died. I want to think that he did, and that she heard him.